Bernie Sanders hosted an Inequality town hall a few nights ago. It featured a bunch of amazing lefties, and during that talk, Michael Moore shared a really amazing fact with us that I didn't know.
Michael, you've been all over the country and all over the world. What's your sense of what's been going on in America in the last 40 years or so?
There was a statistic I read recently that said on any given night in America, nearly 60% of our fellow Americans, if a loved one passed away tonight across the country, they don't have the money to be able to go to the funeral, to fly there. Nearly 60% of this country does not have available to them, access to them, in their pocket, in the bank, whatever, $400. Nearly 60% of our fellow Americans. I've said this since my first movie, Bernie, which in these films I make, they're about a country that has an economic system that's unfair, it's unjust, and it's not democratic. You cannot call this a democracy if the democracy means we just get to go vote. But with the economy, if we have no say in this, then it's not a true democracy. And you mentioned the three men, the three richest men that have more than the bottom 50%. Those three men are not right-wingers. I don't think they're Republicans. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos. These are people that sort of tread water over on our side of the political fence. The question that I hope to talk about tonight a little bit, and maybe when we get to the solutions, is what we need to do to deal with the Democratic Party, because we need a party that's going to be there for the people, for the working people.
So I like this idea. I like the idea that we're taking the partisan aspect away from the conversation, because oftentimes you have just average Joe Republicans who might disagree with us on some things, but there are many areas of agreement that people didn't know that there were areas of agreement. And again, the perfect example of this is Medicare for all. According to some polls, it's a plurality of Republicans who support Medicare for all. That's interesting. You know, it's an overwhelming majority of Republicans who want a universal background check on gun purchases. It's a majority of Republicans that want to raise the minimum wage. Most Republicans don't want to cut Social Security or Medicare under any circumstance. So it doesn't help if it's nothing but sheer partisan bullshit being spewed by people on the left, by Democratic loyalists, because what you're doing is you're alienating a lot of people who would otherwise be with you. And if you can't get them with you, but they're really inclined, based on their beliefs, to be with you in the right circumstances, that's a failure of you to communicate your philosophy and your ideology in an effective way. And I really believe that. And that's one of my biggest problems nowadays with Hillary Clinton. I mean, she just went to India and she, the comments that we covered where she basically says, I won the places that matter. I won the places that represent 2/3 of America's GDP, and I won the forward-thinking, creative places. And, Trump, hey, he won basically the backwards places. And nothing could be a worse message, especially for a party that wants to win. I mean, one of the reasons why those places don't contribute as much to the GDP, Hillary, is because you and your husband supported NAFTA. You supported virtually all these outsourcing deals that ruined manufacturing in the middle of the country. So you have the nerve to support the policies that destroyed that portion of America, and then you turn around and blame them. And then the pivot is, after that happens, well, I mean, they're all bad people, and bad people are going to vote for bad people, so there's nothing I could have done anyway. That's the argument. I mean, they're bad people, and they're racist, and they're bigots, and they're sexist, and they're backwards thinking, so there's nothing I could do anyway. It doesn't matter what I could do. And that's the exact kind of self-serving bullshit that's going to lead to perpetual losses, and it's also not true. If you have some people, thousands of people, in fact, who voted for Obama twice, and then they voted for Trump, maybe it would behoove you to take a look and see if maybe there were certain things you could have done to try to win their vote. And the answer is yes, you could have. If you ran strongly against the trade deals, if you were populist, if you were running against corruption, if you were running in favor of Medicare for all, you could have got their votes. In fact, there's been reports where they talk to these people and they go, yes, we prefer populist Democrats over Republicans. But you gave them the option of a populist Republican, who ultimately was a fake populist, by the way, but a populist Republican versus a status quo, establishment, centrist, corporatist Democrat, and then they picked that Republican. So we need to get beyond the partisanship here. And listen, I'm not naive, so you know who my enemy is? My enemy are the elected Republicans in Washington, D.C. They're my fucking enemy. They're my enemy as much as possible. The corporate Democrats are also my enemy. So I'm not going to play fucking patty cakes with, people who are routinely invested in the destruction of the American middle class and spitting on the poor, and all they want is more war, and they want to give corporate welfare to ExxonMobil and Big Pharma and stuff like that. I'm not interested in them. So I'm fine with calling out DC Republicans and saying, you guys aren't representing your own fucking constituents. But what I'm not fine with is shaming voters who you can get if you just explain to them exactly what you're in favor of. So I think Michael Moore's kind of touching on that at the end when he points out the 3 richest people in America have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of Americans. And he says, hey, listen, man, they're not all Republicans. In fact, those 3, I think, are Democrats. So this isn't a partisan issue here. This is a class issue. This is elites versus non-elites issue. And I think you build more bridges that way and you get a winning coalition that way. Now, furthermore, he's right. He talks about how we're an oligarchy. We're really not a democracy. And that's true. If you vote for Congress and then you go and do a poll a month later and Congress has an approval rating anywhere between 14% and 21%, is that really a democracy? Okay, you just voted for these people, but you despise them immediately after. That's not your fault. It's that you're recognizing you had a choice of the lesser of 2 evils. You picked the lesser evil, but then you go, and sometimes you don't pick the lesser evil, by the way, but you know that they're evil, so that's why when people ask him afterwards, everybody's like, I don't like them. Sure, we just voted for them, but I don't like them. Well, that's a fucking problem. That's a systemic problem that needs to be addressed, and that's where, you get into the conversation about ending corruption by getting money out of politics, ending private financing of elections, which skews it in favor of billionaires and big donors and corporations. And you can move towards a clean, publicly financed election. So you have an actual battle of competing philosophies and ideologies. And then the fact that I didn't know, which I find incredible, is that now he misstates it a little bit because I fact-checked it afterwards. He said about 60% of Americans can't come up with the $400 in case of an emergency or a funeral or something like that. Let me show you what that fact is. It's half of Americans, about half of Americans. So he overstates it a little bit, but I'm still just as floored by this fact. Half of Americans can't come up with $400 in an emergency. Half of Americans. That's unbelievable, man. That's unbelievable. Wow. And they think like you're going to be okay with picking between establishment candidates. Hey, have this person that represents the establishment or have this person that represents the establishment. People don't want the establishment at all if half the country can't afford a $400 emergency. And then we've discussed another fact. By the way, I'm going to add that fact to my repertoire because that's an amazing fact. But also, half of workers in America make $30,000 a year or less. 76% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So, and how many millions of working poor people are there? 45,000 people die every year because they don't have access to basic health care. So don't tell us that we can't pass strong pro-union legislation to make the middle class strong again. Don't tell me we can't pass a living wage or Medicare for all or free college, especially if other developed nations have been able to do all this stuff. You're telling me we can't even catch up to those nations? I want to go beyond that. I want to surpass these nations. I want our infrastructure to go from D+, which we get right now, to an A+. I'm not just I'm not just interested in changing the D+ to a C+. I want to make the D+ an A+ and have the number one infrastructure in the world. So we can do it. But we just need to have politicians who aren't massively corrupt and aren't oligarchs and will represent the people and what you want.